All right, let's go. Number 10. The Decius Persecution in 1893. A team of archaeologists working through papyrus deposits in the Fayum region of Egypt pulled out something no one had specifically been looking for: small, handwritten certificates on papyrus. Each one certified that the bearer had publicly sacrificed to the Roman gods, that they had stood before a government official, poured a libation, tasted the sacrificial meat, and been witnessed doing so. The document was official. It was signed. It protected its holder from prosecution. The certificates were called libelli. More than 40 distinct specimens have since been cataloged and identified. They sit today in the British Library, the Austrian National Library, and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. They are dated to the year 250 AD, a single 12-month window. They represent one of the most precisely documented mechanisms of state religious coercion in the ancient world: physical evidence, in papyrus, of people attempting to navigate a government ultimatum about what they were permitted to believe. The emperor who ordered their production was Gaius Messius Quintus Didius, who seized power in 249 AD and almost immediately issued an edict requiring every person across the Roman Empire to sacrifice to the traditional gods and obtain a certificate proving they had done so. The edict named no religious group specifically. It did not need to. The only community in the empire whose theology made participation in the rite theologically impossible was the one it was designed to reach. What followed over the next 18 months was the most systematic official action against the Christian community in the first 2.5 centuries of its existence: the institutional network of the Roman Church, which by 249 AD had been organizing congregations, acquiring property, producing written texts, and appointing clergy across the empire for more than 200 years, was struck at its leadership tier with targeted precision. Pope Fabian was martyred in January of 250 AD. The vacancy he left was considered too dangerous to fill. No successor bishop would be elected for over a year. The office itself, too, exposed to make appointment survivable. The theologian Origen, who had spent decades in Caesarea Maritima developing the most sophisticated Christian intellectual system of the early period, was arrested and subjected to prolonged torture. He died of his injuries around 253 AD. What might have been the next decade of his work does not exist. In Carthage, the Bishop Cyprian documented what happened to his congregants in precise administrative categories that have survived in his correspondence. Those who had fallen were divided by degree of cooperation: those who had performed the sacrifice itself, those who had offered incense to the imperial gods, and those who had bribed government officials to certify compliance without performing the rite at all. The letters are a taxonomy of institutional collapse under government pressure, produced by a bishop who had himself gone into hiding rather than accept the alternative. The persecution ended not through Christian resistance, not through martyrdom producing political sympathy, not through any action taken by the communities under assault. Decius died in July of 251 AD at the Battle of Abritus, in what is now northeastern Bulgaria, killed in a confrontation with Gothic forces that crossed the Danube into Roman territory. He was the first Roman emperor in history to be killed in battle against a foreign enemy. His successor had no interest in continuing his religious program. The libelli from the Fayum are still in the collections: small rectangles of papyrus. Official documents from a year when the Roman state required every person in the empire to demonstrate loyalty through an act that one specific community considered apostasy. They are the paper record of what compliance looked like. The communities that did not comply and survived left a different kind of record, and the record of both sits in museum drawers, 90 centimeters apart. Before getting to number 9, a quick note: if you want to go deeper into the physical evidence behind these histories, there's an ebook available through the link in the description. It covers the archaeological record confirming major biblical events, the artifacts, the excavation sites, the researchers doing the work. The link is in the description. Number 9. Julian the Apostate, he had been baptized. That matters. The man who came closest, of any Roman emperor, to dismantling Christianity as the intellectual and institutional framework of the empire had been raised inside it, had received its sacraments, had served as a lector reading scripture in the church at Nicomedia, had been educated in the tradition he would later work to reverse. His name was Julian. He became sole emperor of Rome in November of 361 AD after the death of his cousin Constantius II, and within weeks he had reversed the religious policy of the empire, stripped Christian clergy of their state tax exemptions, announced his personal commitment to traditional Roman religious practice, and begun preparing what became clear as the months progressed to be a comprehensive program for cultural reconversion. What followed over 20 months was not crude suppression. Julian had studied the architecture of Christian intellectual culture more carefully than most Christian bishops had. He understood that the church's most durable advantage was not its buildings or its clergy, but its penetration of the educational system. 3 centuries of engagement with Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and science had made Christian intellectuals the most literate and argumentatively sophisticated class in the empire. The strategy he developed was designed to sever that advantage at its roots. The school edict of June 362 AD did not ban Christians from teaching. It required teachers to obtain government approval, which would be contingent on their personal consistency with the values of the texts they taught. Classical rhetoric and philosophy, Julian argued, could only be authentically transmitted by those who held genuine conviction in the tradition they were conveying. A Christian teaching Plato or Homer was, in his view, performing a kind of fraud. Using texts whose gods they privately rejected to educate students in a culture they were undermining. The edict effectively barred Christians from the profession of classical education without naming them. Gregory of Nazianzus, who was studying in Athens when the edict was issued, described its effect in terms that are still precise. It cut off the intellectual hands of a tradition that had spent centuries making itself literate in Greco-Roman culture. The generation of Christian teachers who had built that literacy could no longer practice it professionally. The generation they were supposed to train would be formed by teachers who held different convictions. Julian also wrote. In 362 and 363 AD, he composed a treatise called Against the Galileans, Galileans being his preferred term for Christians, deliberately provincial, stripping them of the universal claims the name Christian implied. The treatise was a sustained philosophical engagement with Christian scripture and theology, its internal contradictions, its borrowings from Platonic tradition, its failure to consistently apply its own interpretive principles. It was not the work of someone who dismissed the tradition as barbarism. It was the work of someone who had studied it and found it sophisticatedly wrong. The treatise was eventually ordered destroyed. It was destroyed. No copy survived the subsequent generation of Christian emperors who had good reasons for its disappearance. The only reason any of it exists today is that Cyril of Alexandria, writing in the 430s, preserved extended quotations while composing his systematic refutation. Against the Galileans survives inside the document written to eliminate it, reconstructible from the passages Cyril quoted in order to argue against them. The text that was supposed to be erased outlasted the empire that erased it, preserved in the margins of its own rebuttal. Julian was killed on June 26, 363 AD, at the age of 31 during the Persian campaign, by a spear wound whose origin ancient sources disputed even at the time. His successor Jovian was Christian. The reversal of Julian's program was immediate, 20 months. That is the duration of his active reign in which the reconversion program operated. What Julian's own writings make clear is that he understood the project as generational. A slow replacement of Christian-educated elites through an educational system that would, over decades, produce a different ruling class. He had identified the correct mechanism. The educational capture that had made Christianity intellectually dominant had taken 3 centuries to complete. Reversing it would have taken comparable time. He lived to begin the first 20 months of a 20-year opening phase. Number 8. The Battle of Tours, the Frankish scouts knew the army of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was close before they saw it. The smell reached them first. The The church of St. Hilary at Poitiers was burning, and the smoke was moving north ahead of the army. When the forces under Charles Martel finally formed their line, somewhere in the territory between Tours and Poitiers, in October of 732 AD, the battle that followed lasted most of a week, ending when Abd al-Rahman was killed in a cavalry engagement and his forces withdrew south toward the Pyrenees. A chronicle written in 754 AD by an anonymous author writing in Iberia, a Mozarab, a Christian living under Arab administrative rule, described the Frankish and Burgundian forces as Europeans. It is one of the earliest surviving uses of that concept as a collective identity, and the chronicler used it to describe the people who had stopped something. The document recording the battle named the opposing populations by what separated them. Edward Gibbon's observation in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776, has never fully left the historiographical conversation. That if the battle had gone the other way, the curriculum at Oxford might eventually have been the Quran. Historians have argued about the battle's actual scale and its strategic decisiveness ever since. Whether Tours was a major civilizational inflection point or a relatively modest engagement that later centuries inflated in retrospect. What is not in dispute is what had already happened and was continuing to happen in every province where similar confrontations had not produced similar results. Richard Bulliet of Columbia University traced the demographic transformation of formerly Christian populations in Arab-administered territories through a method of indirect evidence in his 1979 study Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period. He used mosque foundation records, naming patterns, and the dates at which distinctly Islamic names began appearing in local genealogies to reconstruct the timeline of religious transition in population after population. The conversion curve was not the product of forced mass conversion. It was slow, generational, and structural, the cumulative effect of legally inferior subject status. Differential tax obligations, the closure of careers in administration and military service to non-Muslims, and the gradual removal of social incentives for maintaining minority religious identity over multiple generations. The North African record is the clearest. The province that had produced Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. Three of the most consequential theological minds in the formation of Christian intellectual culture was conquered by the Umayyad general Hassan ibn al-Numan in 698 AD. The Diocese of Carthage lost its continuous episcopal succession within approximately 2 centuries of that conquest. By the 9th century, the organized institutional Christian community of North Africa, the network of bishops, clergy, schools, and congregations that had made Carthage one of the most theologically productive cities in the ancient world, had effectively ceased to exist. Not expelled by decree, not exterminated. Absorbed into the surrounding demographic reality over several generations as the institutional structures that transmitted religious identity ceased to function. The same pattern is visible, at varying speeds, across every Christian province that passed under sustained Arab administration without a military reversal. Syria, Egypt, Palestine, the institutional church dismantled progressively as the incentive structures that sustained it were removed. Tours marks the line where that pattern stopped. The geographic absence of unbroken Christian institutional continuity extends south from that line. North of where Charles Martel held, the institutional record continues. South of it, it does not. The battle marks exactly where the absence stopped. Number 7. The Vandal destruction of the theological heartland in May of 429 AD. A force that ancient sources estimated at 80,000 warriors. Families, clients, and camp followers crossed the Strait of Gibraltar under the Vandal king Gizeric and began moving east along the North African coastline. This was not a raid, it was a migration with military cover, a deliberate relocation of an entire people into the most intellectually and institutionally developed Christian territory in the Western Mediterranean. What made the Vandal assault on North African Christianity unlike anything that had come before, it was its theological specificity. The Vandals were not pagan, they were Arian Christians, adherents of the theological tradition that held the sun to be the greatest of God's creations, supreme above all other beings, but created rather than co-eternal with the Father, and therefore subordinate in a way the Nicene formula explicitly denied. When Gazaric's forces targeted the Nicene churches, schools, and bishoprics of North Africa, they were not conducting a pagan assault on Christianity. They were conducting an internal Christian campaign against a competing theology, which made the destruction more precise, more targeted, and ultimately more damaging to the specific tradition in the specific form it had developed there. Augustine of Hippo, the most influential theologian of the Latin West, died in August of 430 AD, while Vandal forces besieged his city. His biographer Pisidius of Calima was present at the deathbed and left a specific record. Augustine had penitential psalms written out and hung on the walls of his room so he could read them through his final illness. The Library of Hippo, the collection of manuscripts that represented Augustine's working archive, survived the siege, though Pisidius does not explain why or how. The texts were eventually transmitted, but the community that had generated Augustine's thought, had argued with him, had been formed by his teaching, and would have continued his project into the next generation, was destroyed around him while he died. Huneric, Geiseric's son and successor, moved from opportunistic targeting to systematic institutional dismantling. His edict of 484 AD ordered the expulsion of all Nicene clergy from North Africa. Victor of Vita, writing his Historia Persecutionis Africanae Provinciae as a near-contemporary record of these events, catalogued hundreds of bishops driven from their sees, churches seized or closed, the educational apparatus of the most theologically productive Latin-speaking Christian region in the world severed from its students and its buildings simultaneously. The Vandal kingdom fell to the Byzantine general Belisarius in 534 AD, and for a brief period it appeared that the damage might be reversible. But a century of educational interruption does not undo itself when the military situation changes. The system of episcopal schools that trained clergy and theologians had not trained students for a generation. The copying networks that transmitted texts had been broken. The chain of teachers producing students who would become the next generation of teachers had been cut, and the generation that should have existed in the gap, the students formed in the 430s, 440s, 450s, never existed in North Africa in the way they would have. The word Trinitas, Trinity, was coined by Tertullian writing in Carthage around 200 AD. The word persona, as the technical term for the distinct members of the Trinitarian formula, emerged from the same intellectual tradition, the same city, the same concentration of theological energy. Both words are still in active use today in every Christian theological tradition worldwide. In every language that has borrowed its theological vocabulary from Latin. The city where they were coined has no unbroken institutional Christian community reaching back continuously to the time of their coinage. The generation that should have inherited Tertullian's vocabulary directly and built on it without interruption never existed. The schools that would have trained them were closed. The bishops who would have presided over them were expelled. The copying networks that would have transmitted the manuscripts they needed were broken at the point when they were most needed. What the Vandal century did to North African Christianity was not destroy its artifacts. Tertullian's texts survived in other collections across the Mediterranean. It severed the living transmission, the teacher-to-student chain through which a tradition does not merely persist as text, but continues as a practiced intellectual project. The words survived. The people who should have carried them forward did not. Number 6. The Black Death and the institutional collapse of Franciscan friar named John Clyn was keeping a chronicle in Kilkenny, Ireland, in 1349. By the time he wrote his final entry, he had watched most of his friary die. At the end of his last recorded section, he added a brief note in Latin. He was leaving blank pages in case anyone survived with the will and capacity to continue writing. The implication of the note is that he did not expect to survive himself. He appears to have been right. A different hand eventually picked up the chronicle, the script and the ink both change, and continued it from the point where Clyn stopped. The pages he left blank are still blank. The manuscript is in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. The Black Death arrived in European ports in October of 1347, carried by ships from the Black Sea through Sicily. By 1352, it had moved through the Italian peninsula, across France, into the German territories, through Iberia, and into the British Isles. The mortality estimates that modern epidemiologists have arrived at, from parish records, tax records, and manorial accounts, range from roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the total European population dead within 5 years. The numbers remain contested at the margins, but the minimum credible estimates make it the largest proportional demographic catastrophe in European recorded history. The institutional church was not simply present for this disaster. It was positioned, by the requirements of its own function, inside the most lethal environments the plague could reach. The sacramental theology of the medieval church required clergy to be physically present with the dying. Last rites, confession, the administration of the Eucharist to the terminally ill, these could not be conducted at a distance or delegated to the healthy. The priest had to be in the room. The monk lived in a community where infection, once it entered, moved through a population sleeping in shared dormitories with no mechanism for isolation. The Franciscan friar worked the most crowded urban neighborhoods because that was where the tradition of mendicant ministry directed him. The church was most damaged exactly where it had been most completely present. The Diocese of Winchester recorded ordinations running at several times its normal annual rate in 1349, the baseline being approximately 3 to 5 new clergy per year under ordinary conditions. The volume of emergency ordinations, men rushed into orders to fill vacancies left by clergy who had died, documents the scale of the loss. Ralph of Shrewsbury, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, issued a formal dispensation in January of 1349, permitting laypeople, not ordained priests, to hear the confession of the dying. The dispensation exists because there were not enough living ordained clergy in his diocese to perform the sacrament for all the people dying and needing it. Philip Ziegler's 1969 study, The Black Death, documented mortality rates among clergy approaching 45% in some English dioceses during the peak years. The Cistercian monastery of Moe in Yorkshire entered the plague years with 42 monks and recorded 10 survivors. The figures for individual monasteries vary, but the aggregate pattern across monastic records in England, France, and the German territories tells a consistent story. Communities designed to transmit a textual and liturgical tradition through continuous chains of teaching and copying lost between 1/3 and 2/3 of the people responsible for doing that work. Michael Clancy's scholarship on medieval literacy and institutional record transmission, and David Bell's detailed studies of monastic library records across the English and French traditions documented the effect on the copying chains through which manuscripts were reproduced and distributed. Manuscripts are not transmitted automatically. They require scribes who have been trained, who have the technical skills to copy accurately, who know which texts are worth copying and have access to exemplars. When those scribes die in large numbers within a short window, texts that were in the process of being disseminated stop being disseminated. Transmission gaps appear in the record at exactly the years the mortality data predicts. The Council of Basel in 1439 was still auditing the qualifications of clergy who had entered the priesthood under emergency conditions 90 years earlier, men ordained in the chaos of 1348 and 1349 without standard formation, in dioceses where the normal episcopal hierarchy had been partially or largely eliminated. The audit was not a formality. It was an attempt to establish what the institution was in practice. 90 years after a 5-year period during which its standard processes of formation and ordination had largely broken down. John Klyn left blank pages for whoever came next. They are still there in the manuscript. Take a second right now and hit subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Comments come in from every corner of the world on these videos, and the timestamps people leave are genuinely one of the best parts of reading through them. Number 5. The Chinese Cultural Revolution in August of 1966. Red Guard units began moving through Chinese cities targeting what party doctrine categorized as the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Religious buildings were among the first physical targets. The Cathedral of St. Ignatius in Shanghai, a Gothic structure with twin towers completed in 1910, was stripped of its religious contents and converted into a grain storage facility. The South Cathedral in Beijing, the Nantang, which had been built in 1605 by Jesuit successors of Matteo Ricci and rebuilt multiple times since, was closed. Churches across the country were seized, damaged, converted, or demolished as part of a campaign that treated the visible infrastructure of religious practice as both a symbol and a mechanism of ideological contamination. The institutional groundwork for this dismantling had been laid over the preceding decade and a half. The Three Self-Patriotic movement, formalized in 1954, had reorganized Protestant congregations under state oversight, removing foreign missionary personnel, subordinating church leadership to government supervision, and severing the connections between Chinese Protestant communities and international denominational structures. The Chinese Catholic Church's communion with Rome had been effectively severed by 1957, when the state began appointing its own bishops independently of Vatican recognition. By the time the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, the formal organizational structures of Chinese Christianity had already been compromised and placed under government administration. The Red Guards accelerated and completed what the preceding decade had begun. The missionary observer Francis P. Jones documented approximately 800,000 Christians in China in 1949, the year of the communist victory on the mainland. The network of foreign missionaries who had built much of the institutional infrastructure, hospitals, schools, seminaries, publishing operations, was expelled in the early 1950s. David Adeney, who tracked reports from inside China through the 1950s and 1960s as the institutional church was progressively dismantled, documented the steady elimination of the organizational apparatus through which the 800,000 had been organized and served. Jonathan Spence of Yale University, in his Histories of Modern China, documented the comprehensiveness of the Cultural Revolution's assault on every form of institutional religious organization. Patrick Johnstone's Operation World, which surveyed the global state of Christian communities systematically, captured the period as one in which the institutional church in China was, by every observable external measure, effectively eliminated. The error in the state's model was architectural. The plan that the Three Self movement and then the Cultural Revolution had executed was designed against an institution, buildings, clergy, seminaries, printing facilities, administrative hierarchies, formal congregational structures. These were confiscable. These were the things the state had the tools to reach. Eliminate them, and the belief system that required them would dissolve within a generation as the population aged out of the convictions that had been instilled by that institutional apparatus. The mechanism of transmission that the model failed to account for was domestic and required nothing confiscable. A grandmother teaching her grandchildren in a kitchen required no building. No ordained clergy, no printing press, no formal organizational registration. The prayer practices maintained across decades in private households were not accessible to state monitoring in the way that registered congregations were. The household was not the church, and the state's enforcement mechanisms were calibrated to reach the church. The legal framework that governed religious practice in China distinguished sharply between registered, state-supervised congregations and unregistered gatherings. The Three Self structure was designed to make the registered form viable, while rendering the unregistered form illegal. What the framework could not account for was gatherings below the threshold of institutional form. 2 people in a kitchen, 5 people in a living room, a single family maintaining practices across decades without ever reaching the size or visibility that would bring them into contact with state enforcement. The household church did not evade the law through clever hiding. It operated below the resolution at which the law was designed to function. Fenggang Yang of Purdue University, in his 2011 study Religion in China, Survival and Revival Under Communist Rule, documented what had grown in the absence of institutional Christianity during the decades of suppression. The household church networks that had operated underground during the Cultural Revolution and its aftermath had expanded far beyond what external observers had estimated while they were invisible. Yang's lower bound figure for Christians in China at the time of his research was 60 million. Credible estimates place the number between 80 and 100 million. In 1949, approximately 800,000. The institutional apparatus demolished over a period of 25 years. The tradition in the decade after full institutional suppression, minimum 60 million. The most thorough work of the Cultural Revolution coincided with the period of maximum underground growth. Number 4. The Nero persecution, the fire, started on the night of July 18th in the year 64 AD, in the vendor stalls at the southeastern curve of the Circus Maximus, where the wooden structures were dense and the alleys between them narrow enough that fire moved faster than people. It burned for 6 days, subsided, then reignited in a different quarter and burned for 3 more. When it finally stopped, 10 of Rome's 14 administrative districts had sustained damage. 3 had been entirely destroyed, and Nero required a credible population to absorb public anger about what had happened. Tacitus, writing his annals roughly 50 years after the event, with access to sources who had been present in Rome during the persecution, describes what followed with a precision that is one of the earliest detailed pagan accounts of the Christian community's existence. The people Nero targeted were arrested, dressed in animal skins and set on by dogs in public spectacles, crucified, and used as torches after dark to illuminate the imperial gardens. Tacitus records, and this detail matters, that the crowd watching these events began to feel a movement of pity, not because they doubted the charges, because the scale and the manner of the suffering seemed excessive relative to any genuine crime against the public. The movement Nero targeted in the summer of 64 AD was 30 years old. Paul's letter to the Roman congregation, written around 57 AD, addresses a community of genuine organizational complexity, multiple households hosting assemblies, a leadership structure, internal theological disputes already in progress. But there was no written gospel. Mark's gospel is dated by the scholarly consensus to somewhere in the range of 65-70 AD. When Nero's officials began making arrests in Rome, the foundational narrative of the tradition, the account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that would become the textual anchor of every subsequent development had not yet been committed to written form. Peter was in Rome. Paul was in Rome. Both were executed under Nero, and both deaths are attested in sources early enough to carry independent weight. The letter known as 1 Clement, written from the Roman Church to the Corinthian Church around 96 AD, confirms that both men died as victims of persecution and associates their deaths with the Neronian episode. Clement of Rome and later Tertullian place Paul's death, beheading on the road to Ostia in the same period. The tradition connecting Peter's crucifixion to Rome and to Nero appears in multiple independent early sources. The span of Paul's documented travel in the canonical account alone, Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Galatia, Crete, Malta, Rome, represents a geographic distribution across the eastern and central Mediterranean that no single city's persecution could reach simultaneously. His letters, written to communities that already had some organizational form before his arrival in each city, document a network in which Rome was a significant node but was not the network itself. The 7 letters Paul wrote to communities outside Rome, communities that Nero had no mechanism to identify or reach in the summer of 64 AD, represent a distributed archive of the tradition that existed before the Roman persecution and continued after it. Excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica that began in 1939, conducted initially under the direction of Ludwig Koss and then pursued in detail by the archaeologist Margherita Guarducci, revealed a 1st century necropolis under the floor of the basilica and at its center. A small votive shrine positioned above a tomb cavity in a position of deliberate veneration. Guarducci published her extended analysis in 1960. The shrine documents a veneration tradition continuous from the 1st century at the location where the basilica was later built, physical evidence that a community was marking that spot as significant from an early point. Before there was an institutional incentive to fabricate the association, what made the Roman Church survivable in 64 AD was not the response of the Roman Christians to what was being done to them. The community could be reached. The network it was part of could not. The tradition had spent 30 years expanding to Antioch, to Corinth, to Ephesus, to Philippi, to Thessalonica, to Galatia, to communities across the eastern Mediterranean that Roman officials in 64 AD had no mechanism to target simultaneously. When Nero's program ended with his death in 68 AD, the institutional losses were real and the human cost was severe. But the tradition had already distributed itself beyond what any single city's persecution could reach. The shrine is 12 meters below the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica. The survival of what it marks was not determined in 64 AD. It was determined in the 30 years before that summer, by the expansion that had already made the tradition larger than any single node. Number 3. The Diocletianic persecution on the morning of February 23rd, 303 AD, the Feast of Terminalia. The Roman festival marking the end of the religious year, soldiers arrived at the large church in Nicomedia, the principal city of the Eastern Empire, and began tearing it apart. The church was visible from the imperial palace. The Emperor Diocletian and his co-ruler and son-in-law Galerius stood at a window and watched. Lactantius was a Christian rhetorician employed at the imperial court in Nicomedia and was present during these events. He later wrote De Mortibus Persecutorum, on the deaths of the persecutors, a work of explicit theological polemic, but one that contains detailed first-hand and near first-hand accounts of the decisions made at the highest level of the imperial government during the persecution. He records the debate between Diocletian and Galerius as the demolition of the Nicomedia church proceeded. Galerius, who had pushed for the persecution and would drive its escalation, pressed for burning the congregation inside the building. Diocletian refused. The palace was too close, and the risk that the fire would spread was too great. The building came down. The congregation was dispersed rather than killed on that day. What followed over the next decade was the most organized, most sustained, and most thoroughly documented institutional assault on Christianity in the first 3 centuries of its existence. The first edict, issued on the morning of the Terminalia, ordered the destruction of church buildings throughout the empire and the burning of Christian scriptures wherever they were found. The second ordered the imprisonment of clergy. The third offered liberation to imprisoned clergy who agreed to perform the sacrifice. The fourth required universal sacrifice across the entire population, the Decian template now executed with the full administrative machinery of a larger, more internally organized Roman state. Eusebius of Caesarea, who was directly present in the Eastern Empire during the persecution, and who was writing parts of his ecclesiastical history as a contemporaneous record, describes conditions that are difficult to absorb. Prisons designed for the empire's actual criminal population were emptied of their ordinary occupants to make room for clergy, then filled to the point where the basic logistics of holding that many prisoners in those spaces became unmanageable. The volume of arrested clerics exceeded the institutional capacity of the Roman carceral system. It is in this context that a specific Latin word entered common usage in a new sense. The word traditor, one who hands over, referred originally to Christians who surrendered copies of Scripture to Roman officials in response to the order that Scriptures be burned, choosing the destruction of texts over their own arrest and possible execution. The debate over whether the traditors had committed an act of apostasy that disqualified them from their offices, and whether clergy ordained by traditor bishops were legitimately ordained, became the defining internal controversy of the following century. The word, in its meaning of betrayer, is the etymological origin of the English word traitor. The language carries the mark of what happened. Excavations at Caesarea Maritima conducted by the Joint Expedition in the 1970s and 1980s identified destruction layers at multiple locations beneath the construction strata associated with the Constantinian building program, physical evidence, and the archaeological stratigraphy of the damage the persecution inflicted on a major urban center before the political reversal made large scale. Rebuilding possible. In April of 311 AD, Galerius, the man who had argued for burning the congregation in Nicomedia and who had driven the escalation of the persecution through its most intense phase, issued the Edict of Serdica. Preserved in both Lactantius and Eusebius, it is one of the most remarkable documents in Roman administrative history, a formal acknowledgement by the instigating emperor that the campaign had failed. Galerius wrote that Christians, rather than returning to traditional religious practice under pressure, had simply stopped practicing religion of any kind, leaving the religious situation worse than the edict had been designed to address. He permitted them to resume worship. Lactantius records that Diocletian had a commemorative column erected in Nicomedia inscribed with a declaration that Christianity had been extirpated. The column was razed. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. The Traditor controversy, the argument over what was owed to those who had surrendered scriptures, and over whether the clergy those traditors had subsequently ordained were legitimately ordained at all, split the North African Church into factions that would not be reconciled for more than a century. The Donatist position held that traditors had committed an act of functional apostasy that permanently disqualified them from priestly functions, and that sacraments administered through traditor-ordained clergy were therefore invalid regardless of the recipient's innocence. The Catholic position held that the validity of a sacrament was not contingent on the worthiness of its minister. The argument consumed the intellectual energy of some of the most capable theological minds of the 4th and 5th centuries, including, at length, Augustine the Persecution failed to eliminate the tradition. The wounds it opened inside the tradition occupied Augustine's attention from his appointment as Bishop of Hippo in 395 AD until the Vandal forces who ended the controversy. By destroying the institutional context in which it was being conducted, arrived at the walls of his city in 430 AD. The persecution failed. The damage it caused outlasted it by a century. Number 2. The Arian crisis in the year 356 AD. The imperial notary Diogenes arrived at the Cathedral Church of Alexandria, accompanied by a military escort and carrying documentation of an order. The third such order directed at the same man, requiring the Bishop Athanasius to vacate his episcopal see and present himself for transportation into exile. Athanasius had been conducting an evening service. His congregation was present and aware of what was happening. In the disorder that followed the soldiers' arrival, the congregation surrounded their bishop physically, creating a barrier between him and the official. In the chaos, Athanasius was passed out through a side door by his own people and out of the city before the soldiers could reach the altar. He spent 17 of his 45 years as Bishop of Alexandria in exile. 4 separate exiles under 4 different emperors. The phrase that became attached to him, Athanasius against the world, was not rhetorical elevation. It was, during significant stretches of the 4th century, a reasonably accurate description of his institutional position. The crisis that produced this situation had begun in Alexandria a generation earlier. Around 318 AD, a presbyter of the Alexandrian Church named Arius began teaching a doctrine about the nature of the Son of God that was precise, internally coherent, and theologically catastrophic in its implications if true. Arius argued that the Son was the first and greatest being God had created, incomparably above all other creatures, the agent through whom everything else came into existence, but created rather than co-eternal, contingent rather than necessary. Having a beginning in time, even if that beginning preceded all other beginnings. His formula was memorable and exact. There was a time when the Son was not. The implications were total. If the Son was a creature, however supreme, then the worship directed at him by Christian communities for 3 centuries had been directed at something that was not God in the sense the Father was God. The tradition had been worshiping something it had not accurately identified, and doing so while explicitly condemning idolatry. The Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine in 325 AD and attended by bishops from across the empire, produced the Nicene Creed and the doctrinal term of the same substance to define the relationship between Father and Son in a way that explicitly excluded Arius's position. Arius was condemned and exiled. The controversy appeared, officially, to be resolved. It was not resolved. Constantine's enthusiasm for Nicene theology cooled over the following decade. After his death in 337 AD, the empire split between his sons, and the theological question became inseparable from the political competition between them. Constantius II, who became sole emperor of the entire empire in 353 AD, held Arian or semi-Arian convictions and used imperial authority with systematic consistency to reshape the institutional church in that direction. Nicene bishops were removed from their sees and replaced with Arian or semi-Arian appointments. Counter-councils were convened to produce creedal formulas that moved away from Nicaea. The Council of Sirmium in 357 AD produced what contemporaries called the Blasphemy Decree, a document that went further than any previous imperial theological intervention. It banned the phrase of the same substance from theological discussion by imperial decree. Not merely the Arian position, but the specific vocabulary of the Nicene response was outlawed by the government of the Roman Empire. The emperor had made a particular word illegal. By 359 AD, at the councils of Rimini in the west and Seleucia in the east, the situation had reached the point that Jerome later described with the compression that has kept the phrase in use. The whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. Nearly every bishop in the Western Church had, under varying degrees of direct and indirect imperial pressure, signed formulas compatible with Arian theology. The institutional church, the same buildings, the same hierarchical structure, the same clergy, had been officially imperially redirected toward a different theological content. Constantius II died in November of 361 AD without having solidified the transformation permanently. Julian succeeded him, then Jovian, then Valentinian, and the imperial religious policy shifted with each succession. Theodosius I convened the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, which confirmed the Nicene formula as the definitive theology of the empire and condemned the Arian and semi-Arian positions that had held imperial favor for more than 20 years. Athanasius had been dead for 8 years before his position received that vindication. What had sustained the Nicene position through the decades when institutional authority and imperial power were both working against it was not the official structure of the church. That structure was being systematically replaced with compliant appointees. It was the communities that imperial reach could not effectively govern. The monastic settlements in the Egyptian desert formed around teachers and communities that had committed themselves to Nicene theology and maintained their positions through decades of imperial hostility, in locations where sending soldiers was possible, but governing the situation after they arrived was not. Anthony of Egypt, Pachomius, and the communities that formed around them in the Thebaid operated at a distance from imperial administrative centers that made close monitoring impractical. What the desert communities produced in the decades of Constantius's Arian program was not military resistance or political organization. They produced manuscripts. The letters of Athanasius, preserved in monastery copying rooms through the period when imperial policy had made those letters legally problematic to own, circulated in the desert networks that the palace at Sirmium had no efficient mechanism to reach. In those communities, in defiance of what the emperor had signed at Rimini, men were copying the letters of Athanasius. Preserving the arguments for the position that imperial policy had outlawed, maintaining a textual tradition in the desert that the palace in Sirmium had declared forbidden. The Nicene formula that defines Christian orthodoxy in every tradition that traces itself to the 4th century councils survived its most vulnerable decades not in the cathedrals of the imperial cities. It survived in the handwriting of men who had decided the desert was preferable to compliance. Number 1. The Soviet anti-religious campaign in 1937. The Soviet government conducted a national census that included, for the first time in a Soviet census, a direct question about religious belief. The question was framed as an act of documentation. The revolution was 20 years old. The program of mass literacy and scientific education had been running for a generation, and the expectation within the apparatus responsible for conducting the census was that the results would confirm what the broader project of Soviet cultural transformation was supposed to have achieved. The question was expected to produce a number close to 0. The result would be presented as evidence that the project was complete. 56.7% of respondents identified as believers. Joseph Stalin suppressed the census. Ivan Kraval, the director of the Central Statistical Administration responsible for conducting it, was arrested. His deputies were executed, the results were classified and removed from public access. A new census was conducted in 1939. The question about religious belief was not included. The institutions that had been charged with producing the expected result had been substantial, systematic, and amply resourced. The League of the Militant Godless had been founded in 1925 under Emelian Yaroslavsky, born Minnie Gubelman, and had grown to 5.5 million registered members by 1932. Its flagship publication, The Godless, was a mass circulation newspaper that ran anti-religious content, reported on the progress of the campaign, and covered the closings of churches and the prosecutions of clergy as news of public interest. The League operated its own museum system, institutions dedicated to the scientific and materialist analysis of religious claims. Designed to provide populations with the intellectual tools to recognize religion as superstition. The Godless 5-year plan, launched in 1932, set explicit and time-bounded targets. By 1933, the last religious publication in the Soviet Union would be eliminated. By 1935, every religious organization in the country would be dissolved. By 1937, the census year, religion would be eradicated from Soviet life. The 5-year plan was designed to coincide with the census, so that the census would document the completion of a project. The Russian Orthodox Church had entered the year 1917 with approximately 54,000 functioning churches across the territory of the empire. By 1939, fewer than 500 remained open, a reduction of more than 96% of the institutional infrastructure within 22 years. The speed and completeness of the institutional dismantling was without precedent in the history of organized Christianity's interaction with hostile state power. The Dacian persecution had lasted 18 months. The Diocletianic persecution had lasted a decade. The Soviet campaign had been running continuously for 22 years and showed no sign of concluding. Dmitry Pospielovsky, in his 1984 study The Russian Church Under the Soviet Regime, compiled mortality estimates from the documentation available before the Soviet archives were partially opened. Approximately 100,000 clergy executed or dead in labor camps between 1917 and 1940. Subsequent archival research by Mikhail Shklovsky, working after 1991 with NKVD operational records that had been inaccessible during the Soviet period, indicated that the actual figures were likely higher. The documentary record of the campaign is extensive precisely because the Soviet state kept meticulous records of its own operations, a bureaucratic thoroughness that eventually made the record of its methods available to the historians studying them. Paul Froese of Baylor University, in his 2008 study, The Plot to Kill God, characterized the Soviet anti-religious campaign as the most thoroughly documented state attempt to eliminate a religious tradition in recorded history. The characterization is based on the completeness of the operational records, the number of churches closed, and when, the number of clergy arrested and on what charges, the membership numbers of the League of the Militant Godless, year by year, the budgets allocated to the museum network, the production figures for anti-religious publications. The Soviet state documented its own project with the bureaucratic precision of an industrial operation. The structural error in the model was the same error the Chinese state would make 3 decades later, and it was the same error that every previous attempt to eliminate the tradition through institutional targeting had made. The model identified the tradition with its visible, confiscable, monitored infrastructure, church buildings, clergy, seminaries, printing operations, administrative hierarchies, formally registered congregational structures. These were real, they were important, and they were reachable. Destroy them, and the belief system that required them would dissolve within a generation as the population formed by secular education replaced the generation formed by religious instruction. The mechanism that the model failed to account for was domestic transmission. The grandmother teaching her grandchildren in a kitchen required no building and no ordained clergy. The household maintenance of prayer practices across decades of institutional absence required no printing press and no registered organization. The passing of a Bible, a physical object, not a congregational gathering, from parent to child required nothing that a census of church buildings or a registry of clergy could detect. The household was not the church. The Soviet monitoring apparatus was calibrated for the church. The League of the Militant Godless had its own measure of this failure. Its membership peaked at 5.5 million in 1932 and then declined steadily through the decade, not because the anti-religious campaign had succeeded, but because the social incentives for belonging to a mass organization dedicated to the elimination of a thing that appeared to have already been eliminated were diminishing. By the late 1930s, the League's own publications were reporting difficulty retaining active membership. The external infrastructure of religion had been dismantled. The internal mechanism, the private household, the personal memory, the object passed between generations, had not. Stalin reversed the anti-religious campaign in September of 1941. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the pastoral networks of the Russian Orthodox Church proved to have organizational reach into civilian populations across the occupied and threatened territories that the Soviet administrative apparatus, having spent 24 years dismantling those networks, could not replicate. Metropolitan Sergius was permitted to convene a council of bishops in 1943 and was elected patriarch, an office that had been vacant since 1925. The institutional church that had been reduced to fewer than 500 open buildings was permitted to resume something like organized function. The reversal confirmed what the 1937 census had documented 6 years earlier. The project had failed to reach what it most needed to reach. The 96% of institutional infrastructure that had been eliminated was real. The 56.7% of the population who identified as believers 6 years after the Godless 5-year plan's target date was also real. The 1937 census forms are in the State Archive of the Russian Federation in Moscow. Ivan Kraval, who directed the census that produced them, was arrested for producing them. The deputies who approved the methodology were executed. The forms survived because archives are harder to purge than people, because the record of a project tends to outlast the attempt to erase the record of its failure. They documented a campaign that had eliminated 96% of the institutional infrastructure of a tradition that had been the dominant organized religion of the Russian population for 1,000 years. They also documented in the single line that got the census director arrested and his deputies killed what remained when the infrastructure was gone. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.